I'm going to be answering the AS Media Evaluation question, and this is question 7. Question 7 is, looking back at your preliminary task, what do you feel you have learned in the progression from it to the product? So there are many different things that I've done differently, and my blog and exploring all these websites, tutorials, films, and just everything that I've done so far has made me change and develop my skills in what I've done in comparison from the preliminary task to my film opening. So the first thing that's definitely different is the quality of the shot. So things like just learning to hold the camera steady and moving it and using the different shots such as tracking, panning, using different shot types, extreme close-up, long shot, mid-shot, extreme long shot. Just different camera techniques like that have made a huge difference to the quality of my film. In my preliminary, I used a few different shot types, like a few close-ups, long shots, and the odd mid-shot, but I didn't really use any sort of tracking or panning, which I definitely included into my film opening. I also didn't consider the different angles, such as low and high angle shot, and therefore didn't really tell much of a story and just followed a girl walking into a room, sitting down, and then having a brief conversation with her friend. However, I did use some basic filming rules such as match on action, the 180-degree rule, and over-the-shoulder shot. And I did these because I needed to practice my filming techniques. It also allowed me to use the editing software Final Cut Pro and have a really quick, basic idea of how to use that, which hopefully I felt would help me when it came to actually filming. I had a few basic rules to consider, understanding of how to use the software that I'd probably be editing on. Also, in preliminary task, I didn't use a tripod, and I used my friend's phone to film, which was not high quality, so therefore the image that you see, the picture isn't the best, and it can be shaky at times due to not using a tripod. Whereas in my opening, I used a camera and filmed in HD. I also made sure the 2 shots that I filmed on my phone, they were also in HD, and I also used a tripod throughout my film at various points, mixed in with a few handheld camera shots. I didn't take into consideration lighting in my preliminary task. I didn't look into colouring or much of the composition. Preliminary task did not have a plot. The lighting, I just used the lighting that I had in that classroom. I didn't even think about turning the lights on to give myself any quality or portray any sort of mood. The colours that I used, just what I had around me. Whereas in comparison to my film opening, I really thought about the lighting, and when I was filming, because I was filming outside, I made sure to overexpose the camera, because I couldn't really use much lighting outside, because we didn't have the equipment available to us. Therefore, I overexposed the camera, and then I could go back and edit the lighting in, create shadows and depth. The composition of my piece was just, I thought about it a little bit, but it was literally just, she's going to go through that door and sit down, and I'm going to get in the shots that I need to get in to, learn to use them. And it was just literally basic, her walking into a room and sitting down. Whereas in my composition on my actual piece, I really thought about the angles, where he was going to be placed when he starts to the end, and I did that using my storyboard. And so I showed the composition, and I really thought about the different things that I wanted to include within that. So the sound was a big thing that I didn't use in my preliminary task. All of the sounds that you hear in the preliminary task are what the iPhone picked up. So it was just the basic sound from the camera that the camera picked up. So you get the ambient sounds that shouldn't be there, because they're just, things I don't want to include, and I didn't edit them out or use Foley sounds or anything like that. I just basically used the camera sounds that the camera picked up. I didn't tamper with the sounds at all. I didn't change the volumes or put any music in the background or anything, and it was just really poor sound quality. You could barely hear what they're saying, and I didn't think about that at all. Whereas in my opening, sound was one of the major parts of my opening, and each sound effect was done with Foley from sound effects off of Final Cut Pro, and I had muted all of the sounds in my clips and completely edited them back into my opening, and I just took inspiration from the sounds when I was filming, such as birds and things like that, and just from the location that I was in. I took inspiration from the location and then enhanced the sounds. I changed the sound so that the actor would walk by the camera, like his footsteps would be louder and they'd gradually fade as he got away from the camera again, and just little details just to make this sound that more realistic and that more effective, so that the audience gets a really effective sound. I also thought about music. I use like non-diegetic music as a soundtrack, which I edited in and used the different sound levels to gradually bring the sound into the opening and then faded it out again towards the end. I also thought really carefully about them and overlapped sounds at different points. So things like continuity with my costumes and props. In my preliminary tasks, like, I didn't think about costumes at all. We were in school and therefore they were wearing their school uniform, so they were just wearing what they were wearing and I didn't have any say upon that. I literally just filmed them how they came in that day. Therefore it didn't necessarily represent them or what I wanted them to be represented as, whereas in my actual opening I really thought about the costume. Detail of his costume was specifically chosen to match his character and what I wanted the audience to really portray him to be and show certain characteristics of him. So that was really carefully thought out in comparison to my preliminary, where it wasn't thought out at all and they could just wear whatever they wanted to wear. Things like props, they didn't really have any props. Again, there was a few people in the background who were just reading, who happened to be just reading, and there was a few bags around just because there were bags, but I hadn't actually placed them there for any reason. I didn't remove them, I just left them because that's how people had left them. So in a way it sort of created a realistic school situation, because it was realistic, but I hadn't thought about them and they were just there and I just wasn't going to move their stuff. Whereas in my actual opening, there's a shot where we filmed my actor walking down the stairs and we realised there was a sun lounger which was folded up and it was on the side of the stairs, and that did not look right to me and I didn't want that to be in my shot, and that wasn't one of the props I wanted, so we simply moved it out of the shot. He had little props on like a watch. You can barely see it and it was literally just there, so if the camera picks up on it at any point it picks up on it, if it doesn't, it doesn't. They were the main props and it was mainly, making sure the area was clear of anything that I didn't want to be in there, in comparison to my preliminary where I didn't mind if there was props in the way that I didn't want to be there or characters just in the background. So continuity and editing, I considered things like match on action, eyeline match, 180-degree rule and over the shoulder shots. I considered them a lot in my preliminary task, and in my opening I didn't need to consider match on action. Shot over shot wasn't an issue in my actual opening. The 180-degree rule, however, was taken into consideration just to make sure that my character, the way that he was walking and where he was walking to, everything was created continuity and everything matched up and he wasn't jumping, of course, on the screen. So overall, I think my preliminary task and my actual opening, they were on different levels, and I think the preliminary task was literally basic and just filming someone coming into a room, not really considering anything else besides getting in the film rules, whereas in my opening there was a lot to consider in comparison. I just learnt so much through making my blog, and that's what helped me to develop, to learn those different skills and to really consider them when watching other films and looking at the genre conventions, to just literally just watching movies and learning more about, the types of shot that they'd use. Even basic things like watching films and picking up on the letterbox, just to create a realistic looking film and make it look that little bit more professional. To researching into films, things like Big Hero 6, where I really studied into the lighting and learnt quite a bit about lighting and how much it can have an impact on the audience and the way that the audience interprets and responds to different lighting and the use of the lighting. found out a really interesting point with that when they had Baymax, when he didn't have the lighting in him using the Hyperine, that the audience didn't respond to him as well and felt like he wasn't that character that they really warmed to in the film. Just watching films, I learnt how the different lighting affects and sets, a mood and creates different vibes for the whole film and how it can really affect it. Also, just watching peers' work and speaking to teachers, speaking to my friends, discussing what they had learnt as well. When colouring, I'd noticed that how a lot of professional films, a lot of them have all used this kind of blue-green toned look, and a lot of them have this tone because it creates that kind of sad intensity and all those vibes that I wanted to represent in my film. So therefore I use this blue toned colouring in order to get a professional effect, in order to portray what I wanted to portray. There was just so much more that I learnt through doing my blog that I didn't really think about or know about before when I made my preliminary task. I definitely have learnt a lot throughout this whole experience, and there's many things that I have learnt that I didn't know before. We went to a Film Forever. We had people come in and they talked to us. We met the chief examiner, which was really great because obviously he had some great tips for us and just got to see students' work, and that really had a big effect on what I did personally. Before I even thought about what I was going to really create with my film, going to this meeting Pete and him showing us our peers' work and from other years and stuff, I really picked up on how they grade it and what we see us do and things like that. That was just really, really interesting, and I got to see the different levels of work and how the different levels of work get different grades, and you could really tell the difference between the quality of the lowest grade that we saw to the highest, and you could see the colourings and how much more they had thought about, every detail of their film, and whether it was just from the plot of their film to the colouring or the lighting or the sound effects or any of that stuff used. We also got to see a few people who had directed films, which was really, really interesting. We got to meet Dexter Fletcher. He was really, really good, and he talked about what he wanted to represent and what he'd found out from audiences and how they'd responded to different versions of films, and how just slight tweaks to a film can have such an influence over how people respond to your film and what people think to it. We also got to meet Hannah Rothman and basically just learnt really, really useful tips from her. She also talked about things like and how they emphasise different things, how they achieved everything that they achieved within their film, basically. And that whole day out was really helpful, and it taught me a lot and had a huge influence over my film. Also, looking at things like opening sequences also had a huge impact, because my preliminary task wasn't an opening sequence and I didn't have to consider titles, so I hadn't practiced that or thought about that. So a lot of research went into this, creating titles, and there was quite a few things that influenced that. At first, I really looked into Catch Me If You Can, amazing title sequence, and I had a lot of inspiration for that, and I felt like I really wanted to create a separate title sequence. It was only then when I actually started to look into it, and I realised that I didn't want to create a separate title sequence, and I actually wanted to integrate the two and make the buildings and the objects shaped around each other, and that was mainly after looking at peers' work from a previous year. They did a great opening sequence where they had integrated the two and they'd used the shapes and the objects, so that made it really interesting. And also looking into Foley, researching into Foley was a big thing, and I felt like I learnt so much on how people actually create sounds, and in films you would never usually just use the sound off your phone of what it had picked up. You would always add in the sounds, and therefore even if the sounds aren't necessarily realistic, I learnt that you can create the sound that you want using something completely different, it turning out better than the original sound. So Like, they do some really, really cool things where you think, oh, why don't you just use, your foot to make a stepping sound? And they do something completely different, but it would sound better and actually more realistic than someone just putting their foot down. So that was really, really interesting to learn about, and just analysing different films and the shots and how they use things to frame objects and stuff. That framing was quite an important thing that I had picked up on, and how you can use buildings and objects to frame your characters. Instead of framing with the camera, you can frame people walking, people moving using the objects that you have around you, which is really, really effective, I thought. I also really had to look into things like target audiences and consider that. I mean, my preliminary, there was nothing to consider like that. I didn't have to consider things like target audience, and obviously that had an influence on what I created, dependent on who I was trying to appeal to. And in my case, I'd say middle-aged plus, slightly older than middle-aged, but that kind of audience. And it was really interesting to find that out. I found that out basically because of the genre that I wanted to do, and then the genre appealed to middle-aged plus people, whereas my preliminary task, it didn't need to appeal to anyone, so therefore I could pretty much do what I wanted with it, and it didn't matter who it appealed to because it just didn't really matter. So whereas my piece, I needed it to appeal to people, so therefore I had to create what other people wanted and not just what I wanted. Looking into things like Avatar was really, really, really helpful. I learned so much about technology and things that you can use to create different things, like for CGI, and how they create these animation films. Even though I didn't create an animated film, it was still really interesting to learn that, because you learn how much they take into consideration lighting, movements and things, which helps you to realise that even though you're not making an animation film, that's how important these things are. And they have all this technology for animation films because people move so much, and every little detail of what people do, whether it's just blinking, a facial movement or anything, these things are all really important to how the audience responds to characters. Looking into animation was very interesting because it makes you realise how important the tiniest details are into filmmaking. And obviously Big Hero 6 with lighting, how much of an effect lighting by itself just has. And again, even though I'm not making an animation film, you realise how much lighting they had to render into their film. And then obviously I have natural lighting, but if I wanted to make the lighting look even better, then I'd have to overexpose the camera and edit it in myself. Things like rule of thirds was really interesting to also look into. I could frame each of my shots and make sure that the key points were all going to be in the shots, and that was really helpful because it just meant that my film looked framed well. Everything that I wanted to be in shot was in shot, and it was in the focus points of the audience's eyes. That was just really helpful. And I even had to consider things like locations. My preliminary task, I could have filmed it anywhere. It didn't matter to me where I filmed it, I just wanted to film it. Whereas for my film opening location, I had to go on location hunt and look at different places, different landscapes, just see the landscapes that were on offer to me and what I had to work with, really. And that was quite a big part of it also, in comparison to the preliminary, because the preliminary, we didn't need to consider any of that. Obviously, I had to create a storyboard for my piece, which made me carefully consider each shot, the sounds that I wanted, the movements I wanted, the costumes I wanted, the props I wanted, the location, just every detail. I wanted it to be planned out, so I knew exactly what I was doing. Whereas my preliminary, I went along with whatever I thought, and I just filmed it. I had no storyboard. I barely considered what I was going to do. I just knew I needed to get in these filming rules, and I thought, okay, well, to get matching action, probably easiest if someone walks through a door. To get over the shoulder shot, maybe if you just have, say a few quick lines, I can film over the shoulder, and 180 degree roll, I'll stick to my side, when I'm filming this, and just did whatever, really. I didn't really take into consideration anything to do with a storyboard or plan it out at all. One lunch I was just like, okay, we'll go film it now, which in comparison by opening, I spent weeks and weeks and weeks planning to do this. I also had to take into consideration different pieces of equipment that were available to me, whereas preliminary I just used handheld camera work and a iPhone, whereas in my actual piece I used a tripod, an iPhone 6, and 2 cameras, one just to, look at shots through and frame shots, and then the actual camera to film them, and then the tripod. And I also looked at different pieces of equipment, mini tripods, sliders, shoulder rig, just all these things, so that I could, really consider what I wanted to use in my opening. And none of that was considered in my preliminary task. So basically there was a lot. I also needed to take into consideration risk assessment, which in my preliminary task I didn't even think about. My risk assessment was important because it just meant that I could think about the risks before I went to go and film, and I could think about how I can prevent them, make sure me and my actor are both safe, and consider what I'm going to do before I do it, and make sure that me and my actor aren't going to be in any danger. And doing the risk assessment really allowed me to evaluate what was worth doing and what wasn't worth doing. So for my preliminary tasks, that wasn't taken into consideration. There was just a lot of things, even just deciding on a name I had to look into, and for preliminary, it was just called preliminary task. But for my opening, looking into the name was really important for me because I wanted it to have a name that had some meaning and some representation, and therefore by looking into real films, I could gain an idea of how filmmakers name their films and what inspires them to name it. I also really had to learn how to use technology. Technology was really important, and my preliminary basic technology was needed to know how to just cut my clips down, shorten them, and that was it, and just put them together. I didn't even use any transitions, so it was literally just basically cropping the clips and making them shorter and putting them together, whereas in my actual opening there was much more of a understanding needed to be able to create some of the stuff that I created, and I needed to learn how to use the softwares, and I needed to develop my skills. In order to do that, I created rushes. So I basically went out and shot some clips of trees and then went back inside and edited them and learnt to use different techniques like Ken Burns crops, transitions, text, colour, how to colour grade, and just all the little details, although I hadn't actually added in any sound effects into my rushes. So yeah, there was definitely a lot that I had to consider with editing in comparison to just my preliminary tasks where it was very, very basic. I had to learn to use Adobe After Effects, which I had to learn to use like the basics of After Effects. I had to mask and keyframe in order to do a certain shot. So in my preliminary, Adobe After Effects wasn't even in my mind. It wasn't a consideration. But then for my opening, to create some of the things that I wanted to create, it had to be taken into consideration. A few little special effects and stuff. I didn't use any special effects in my preliminary tasks, whereas in my opening I used things like rain, I used raindrops into puddles, and just little things like that. And on the wording, I made sure that the wording in one of my shots moved with the river, the little lake, the close-up of the lake, and I just made sure that moved with it, which I didn't need to do in my preliminary tasks. Special effects, there was none. It was literally just basic camera work. Again, I had to get feedback from my peers and really take on board what they felt was good, what they felt was bad, and how I could improve it. Whereas my preliminary, I didn't take into consideration that didn't matter to me. Whereas on my opening, this definitely mattered to me, and it changed my film a little bit, and I edited it to what people felt looked good and worked better than what I thought looked better, and I evaluated between the two and decided what I was going to take on board and what I was not going to take on board. So there was definitely a lot of difference between my opening and my preliminary task, and the level of skill that was used was definitely more advanced in my film opening than my preliminary, and also the level of detail and attention and time required was definitely a lot more.